Right, let's start out with an interesting fact. So when we learn world history, usually in a Japanese school setting, what happens is it's interesting because the point you start learning world history in Japan and, for example, places like in the States or like places in Germany or like places in America are quite different. Usually in Japanese studies, they usually start from um, when humanity started, which means, yeah, people started walking from Africa. They started walking along from Africa, and then they start going around places. They go between lakes, or they find like the Nile, or they find other food source and stuff. And then they just keep going on and on and on, and they cover pretty much all parts of history until usually to about 1990. These days, even in world history, sorry, 19, more like not 1990, but they continue all the way until usually world history classes end around 2001, which symbolizes 9/11. This is usually where it is said to be world history or a part of class within world history. Yes, they usually start from when humanity started, then all the way to 9/11. They cover everything that's going on in the world. The interesting thing is, like, of course, we have a lot of stuff that happens in history, but which parts of history must be taught? This is an interesting question because every time a certain, for example, textbook maker or somebody within the Bureau of Education, in Japanese is the Monkasho, chooses what to teach in world history, it's interesting to look into what significant events they often try and integrate into history education. Because when you look into the details, like world history, there's so much information in it, and there's so much context, so many people being involved in it, a lot of detailed experiences that people had. But out of everything that has happened from the start of humanity to 9/11 in 2001, in what standard do you think that people are actually choosing the parts of history to learn? This is a good question because usually these are symbolized by, for example, usually starts from effect in society. For example, if I were to teach you, like in BC 500, there was a guy who had a spear and the guy killed a mammoth and they were eating mammoth meat. Or let's go to like in 1961, there was a guy who was eating popcorn while lying on his couch and watching a weird 60s love drama movie. Those aren't significant and they don't have any effects in society. So usually if a certain event has an effect on society, usually that is usually included in what we are taught in world history. Another thing is, if it affected the way of thinking within that society, these are usually called ideal, ideology. Even in katakana, it's sometimes said as ideology, but ideology is something. It is a social consensus. It is something that everybody thinks that is needed or is something that everybody thinks the same of. For example, in early 1200s, the ideology was whether you should be supporting the Pope or whether you should be supporting God. It's usually these kind of thoughts, or even in these days, one of the ideologies that we have is that, for example, China is a big country and might be attacking Japan, or those kind of things that everybody is thinking about the same in a society is an ideology. So yes, again, go back to the question, which parts of history must be taught, or which parts of history are chosen? Are chosen? These are a good question to ask. All right, and one last part. It is usually decided by the effect on society and the way of thinking, but also what happens is, usually what we are taught in world history is chosen by significant. This means 絶大な, or like it means that it's large, significant impact. Yes, it's either events that hold significant impact to the structure of the world. In some events in world history, literally country names are changed, or what people speak, what languages they use, what boss they have, what religion they tend to believe in. Everything changes. Everything changes. So when actually people who are making textbooks or people who are determining what to teach in world history are thinking about are these parts: effect on society, effect on the way of thinking, and significant impact on the structure of the world, usually. So trivial events like Mike having popcorn on his backyard isn't really something that's usually taught in world history, quite obviously, quite obviously. It's the same in Japanese history. Usually when we are taught Japanese history in school, it starts with stuff like, you know, that we don't go into details in the Jomon era or like the Yayoi era. The biggest reason is that it has pretty much none of the events have effect on society or in the way of thinking that we have. That is one big reason. However, there was a reason why a lot of time and effort is put into learning about the Edo era. Let's think about this. So let's think about this. Probably when you are in elementary school or when you were in junior high school, there has to be I guarantee you, there must have been at least one guy who was a historian. Probably a boy, usually. Every school, like literally every classroom, they would have had this one guy who just loves history so much. He knows everything about the Sengoku era, and he knows like everything about like who fought who and what kind of strategy they used in war and stuff, and like what episodes they used to have, like how much of a bad man this guy is or stuff. I'm pretty sure there's one guy. I'm pretty sure there's one guy. And usually what happens is that these guys are really into stuff like war or like say like daimyos. Daimyo is usually just put into like daimyo. daimyo and stuff. It just pretty much just said as daimyo. But they're usually like into war, daimyos, strategies, and so on and so on. But and usually these historian types are the one who always cry out loud during school's history lesson, because within the long history classes that we usually take in school, I don't think you remember doing much about like from like say the Azuchi to the Sengoku era. Yes. And like most people know like about Sekigahara or like other historic events that may have shaped or may not have shaped how this country is currently made. But these types of historic events that everybody loves and all the boys love, all the boys want to know, is pretty much summed up in one page. It's usually just like summed up in one page. Poor historians. Those kids who wanted to learn so much about Oda Nobunaga, or like, those cool guys, Ishida Mitsunari, those guys. All boys like those kind of stories. Like, they like fighting, they like war. But however, usually in school, those aren't considered as significant. It's not significant. Most of the events didn't change ideology. Didn't change ideology. I'm really bad at spelling ideology. And also, it hasn't changed the structure of a country whatsoever. Unfortunately, for these reasons, the Azuchi, like the Sengoku era, like the cool part of history, is not usually taught in school. It's just not taught in school because there's just no meaning in teaching those parts in history. So usually in a Japanese school setting, let's think about this. Usually in Japanese schools, we tend to learn about stuff like, it's more about like religion, people, like names of emperors / like world leaders. We tend to learn about like the names of emperors, the name of leaders. Maybe some people remember the name of like the 5 biggest emperors in Rome or something like that for no reason. I have no clue why I have to remember this stuff. Or we sometimes remember like the political structure, and stuff. This is usually what is said to be significant and stuff that are like supposed to be really important within the world history events. But the big problem in Japanese schools is that all of these are boring. Learning about religion, learn about the names of emperors and like what political structure they're taking, like, or how many times did they do the crusade? Crusade is Jujigun. How many times they did the crusade, or like what type of government they're holding, or what law they had to pass, and by that law, why people were affected in certain ways. Like, these are all boring. Completely boring. I have to remember myself. I still love history right now. I really do. I sincerely love history. But in this regard, just I was not a big fan of remembering names of stuff. Remembering names of stuff. Not cool. Not cool. Just not cool at all. I just didn't have fun on it, honestly. Why am I dropping this? Help me. On the other hand, let's think about what is being taught in other places. For example, let's take a look at Canadian schools, my home. In Canadian schools, what are more likely being taught is basically the logic, and it's usually the geography. There's a chiri in Japan. It's usually told by logic, geography, and the 5W 1Hs of events, of certain events. Yes, the good part about usually in countries that have more context in history is that they teach world history by story, basically. They usually teach it by story. So everything has a reason to it. Everything has a certain logic to it. In order to get a hold of what the logic is. In Canadian schools and American schools, this is interesting. Usually in Japan, you have your Japanese history, or you have your world history, or you got your geography somehow. Or in other words, people like to use the word and yeah, these are usually taught in like many other ways. Like this is one of the biggest problems in Japan. Japan has too many social studies like subjects that you need to be taught. All of these are taught in different disciplines and they are all taught as different subjects. That is a very weird part about Japanese social studies. On the other hand, in most countries that have a better understanding in world history or a better understanding within their history, what they usually do is that they don't divide what they're learning. So even in world histories, in world history classes in like Canadian schools, they have a lot of geography inside it. They also use a lot of ethics inside. They even sometimes learn economics, usually within the world history class. Why? Because they need to understand the logic of what is going on. Within this class, we have been talking about why people move to certain places and then how people have moved certain ways. This is because we want to learn about what the human race has been thinking about and what the human race is always going to do from now on. Okay? So in terms of this, we need to understand the logic, we need to understand the geography, we need to understand the certain parts of ethics. It can be economics, it can be political science, it can be anything you have to do. What I just honestly, from the bottom of my heart, what I really want to say is to get out of just trying to remember things. Such a bad trait, such a bad trait. World history must be learned or world history must be understood through certain contexts. For example, it can be through geography, it can be through everything. Let's get this wrapped up. All right. All right, so let's do this. So All right, let's make this simple. In this class, let's make this simple. I will not include too many names, because the reason being, remembering names or associating people's names with certain eras are absolutely pointless. So in this class, we won't be talking about like, okay, try to remember this. So we won't be including too many names, like only like a few main national names that we should know, or not really should know, but some certain names that we should know in order to understand world history better. Also, we won't be going into stuff too much like remembering names of artwork or like books, you know, or like poems. This happens so many times in Japan. In order to, so this is super weird. In order to get a better understanding of world history, we are forced to remember names of artwork or like books or poem. And the biggest problem is that we are not taught. Nobody teaches us why we have to remember these names, or why on earth we are actually needing to learn this. Usually what artwork and books teach us is to give us a better understanding of what the social situation was at that time and why people were writing such literature. But unfortunately, in Japanese schools, it doesn't go that far. So it's basically pointless because we're just trying to remember names and stuff, right? And there's no meaning in that, obviously. And then finally, we will be focusing a lot in a lot of disciplines, basically. It's not all about like what happened in this year, what happened in this year. We will be focusing more on the geography. The actual history, and also the logic. If a world history teacher or like a certain teacher tries their best, they could probably go as far to be able to explain everything. I mean, literally everything that's happening in the world or that has happened in the world in the past. The biggest reason why is that there is a lot of logic between it. It isn't just, pardon me, it isn't just remembering names, or it isn't just trying to remember like what year, what happened, and what war happened, and who won, and why did they win. It all comes down to this. It's all logic. And people have very, very simple motivations when it comes to world history. And when looking at humanity as a whole, it is very easy to dissect what may have happened. So from this class and on, we will be trying to record stuff in world history in English, but still I will be using a little bit more teeny bit easier English than this. All right, that's it for today. I'll meet you guys soon. And yeah, can't wait to see you guys. Ciao.